Good to have everybody here this morning. Good to have our visitors with us. Appreciate your presence this morning. Way back in the 40s, there was a line of a song that has stuck with me through the years. The line of the song went something along this line. A woman on my party line's a nosy thing. She picks up her receiver when she knows it's my ring. Why don't you mind your own business? If you mind your business, you won't be minding mine. And that's a Hank Williams song, but it's always kind of tickled me a little bit to hear that line. And I think we all recognize the reality of that line, that no one appreciates a busybody, someone who sticks their nose in your business. Now, I need to give a little explanation to our younger folks here. A party line was when you would have maybe a household or a set of apartments, they'd have a phone line set up so that all of the people in that apartment complex or household or whatever, they'd all be on the same phone line. And basically the phone would ring a certain way for you to know if it was your call or not. But if you picked it up, someone else, one of the other parties, could also pick up their phone and hear your conversation. And so if someone was nosy, they could pick up the phone and eavesdrop on your conversation. And I know I've talked to people who in the past had those type of setups and talked about, neighbors that they would catch eavesdropping on their conversations. Well, obviously a lot of time has gone by and we live in very different times today. But you think about the social media that we have today and how that the opportunity for people to get involved in other people's business is far greater than it ever was. We can put a little something on Facebook or whatever, and literally people by the scores can line up and make comments on what you should be doing or not doing, or what they think about you, or think about what's going on in your life. And we're reluctant sometimes to share with others what's happening because we're fearful of the consequences. And of course, we live in a society now that is characterized by, it seems, everyone criticizing or having some comment on what every individual is doing. And so people are concerned with, political correctness and all these type of things, worried about conforming to what society thinks is best for them. So this morning I'd like to talk a little bit about busybodies. And what do you think of when you think of a busybody? Probably it's a little different for each one of us, but I think of maybe the nosy neighbor, someone who is peeking out their window, pulling down the blinds and spying on all the neighbors and seeing what's going on. And then as soon as they find, something that's interesting going on, they run to the phone and grab it and they begin calling all the people they know to talk about it and share with what's happening and find out what they know about it. That's typically what I envision when I think of a busybody. Or maybe we think of someone who is always telling us what to do. We think of someone who's trying to tell us, what you should eat, telling us what we should wear, what kind of car we should drive, telling us what we should watch on the television, or giving us advice about our marriage or about our children, telling us who we should vote for, so on and so forth. But, people who are just all the time getting in your business and telling you what you should do. So maybe you think about someone along those lines. Well, however you define someone who is a busybody, a meddler, a nosy person, an interloper, however you want to describe it, most of us, I think, would agree that is undesirable, that we don't like for people to be busybodies. We recognize that that's an undesirable trait. But have you ever realized or thought about that actually being a busybody is a sin? That it's something that the Bible speaks about and tells us that we shouldn't do. Well, actually it is. It's something that the scriptures tell us quite a bit about. Now, to begin with, I'd like to look at some verses in the Old Testament, but in preparing to do that, let me mention that hand in hand with the busybody typically is the concept of being a gossip too, that the two kind of go together. Oftentimes someone who is a busybody will also gossip about other people as part of their being a busybody. And some of these Old Testament verses particularly focus on kind of that aspect of it, not on the gossip aspect of it. But if we turn back in the Old Testament, look with me, Leviticus 19:16 is an example of one of the passages back there in the Old Testament that speak on this subject. Leviticus 19:16, there we read, You shall not go about as a talebearer among your people, nor shall you take a stand against the life of your neighbor. I am the Lord. So here it talks about the talebearer, the person who would carry, some story or something that happened with somebody and go spread it among the people. And then somebody, of course, who was also taking a stand, slandering probably is the idea, their neighbor. Over in Psalms 15, if we turn on over a little ways in the Old Testament, we find that the Psalms and Proverbs have quite a few things to say about this issue. Psalms 15 verse 3 is a good example. Psalm 15 and 3 says, he who does not backbite with his tongue, nor does evil to his neighbor, nor does he take up a reproach against his friend. He's answering the question, who may dwell in your holy hill? We always want to dwell in God's holy hill, right? Well, if we're going to do that, we need to be the type of person who walks uprightly, who works righteousness, who speaks the truth in his heart, but also we're not to be someone who is a backbiter with our tongue. We're not to be someone who does evil to our neighbor or to take up a reproach against one's friend. Turn with me over to Proverbs, just the next book there in the Bible. And in Proverbs 11 and verse 13, we have yet some more wisdom here shared about those who would be busybodies and slanderers and meddlers in people's affairs. Proverbs 11 verse 13 says, a talebearer reveals secrets, but he who is of a faithful spirit conceals a matter. Isn't that so wise? That someone may see something that someone would want to be a secret. See something embarrassing that happens to somebody, or some little detail about their life that they really wouldn't want people to know about. The talebearer is going to take that and then just tell everybody. They delight in just exposing anything that could be hurtful or embarrassing to somebody, to everyone around. But it's saying here that, the person with the faithful spirit, they conceal that matter. They see something that happens that they know would be embarrassing, and they just keep it to themselves. They just don't tell anyone about it. And there's so much wisdom in that. That's how we should be. Look over just a little bit further to Proverbs 16 and verse 28. It says, a perverse man sows strife, and a whisperer separates the best of friends. Again, you see the great wisdom here in this verse. There's some people who just go around sowing strife among people. They will go to somebody and say, you know what someone said? They said this about you. Man, what are you going to do about it? Ever seen someone like that? I think a lot of times in the work setting, you'll see people who do that. They'll say, well, hey, guess what happened with so-and-so? Well, what do you think about that? What are you going to do about it? And so they constantly stirring up strife, even between friends sometimes. And these whisperers, what again here is described as a perverse man. Think about that. The one who does this is described as a perverse person. This whisperer, it says, separates the best of friends. How many friendships have been destroyed or at least hurt by someone going around and whispering little gossip and information about somebody and trying to cause contention between people? And it's a very immature trait. We think of it maybe among children, but there's a lot of adults who do that. And it's wrong. And so again, we see the wisdom here that you shouldn't engage in that type of behavior. Right there nearby in chapter 17 and verse 9, it says, he who covers a transgression seeks love, but he who repeats a matter separates friends. So again, the idea there, if someone sees someone, who is maybe done something wrong, but the right type of person is the one who seeks love in that issue, not the type of person who goes and repeats this matter and causes friends to be separated. Again, you see the wisdom there versus foolishness described. And then one last one in Proverbs, go over to Proverbs 26. If you look at verses 20 through 22, it says, where there is no wood, the fire goes out. And where there is no talebearer, strife ceases. As charcoal is to burning coals, and wood to fire, so is a contentious man to kindle strife. The words of a talebearer are like tasty trifles, and they go down into the inmost body. Now, again, you see the wisdom here, and great illustrations of what is being talked about here. Now, we understand that if there's no wood, the fire is going to go out. I mean, that just common sense, right? Well, such a great application here. Where there's no talebearer, strife ceases. There's no one carrying tales, gossip, rumors about other people. Strife is going to go out. There's nothing to be, fighting about, or nothing to keep the contentions going. Just as the fire goes out when there's no wood. You don't have someone who's a busybody carrying around tales about people and stirring up trouble. Well, then strife is going to cease. There's going to be peace when that person's not around. And then again, we understand the same thing with charcoal and burning coals and wood and fire. Without fuel, they're not going to continue. And so again, the repeating of the idea, so is a contentious man to kindle strife. Without a contentious person, things just calm down. And, I'm sure most of us have had experience with that. You've been in the workplace, and there's someone in the workplace, and while they were there was always fighting, arguments, contention, strife, all kind of, turmoil going on, and then that person leaves, and suddenly the place is just as peaceful as it can be. Maybe sometimes you're in a congregation, and there's a certain person there in the congregation, and there's just always trouble and problems going on, and that person leaves, and everything calms down. Everybody's getting along with one another. Well, it's just an illustration of what the wisdom is here, that there can be people who are busybodies, talebearers, people who get into others' business and just stir up trouble among people. And it's showing that when they're gone, the trouble dies down. So we see here that these verses obviously share a lot of wisdom on what we're to avoid and what we're not to be. But going over to the New Testament, there's some verses there that talk about the idea of busybodies, and it's something to be avoided, something that should not be true of us. And it's interesting the context in which these are found too. The first one's in 1 Timothy chapter 5. Now the context of 1 Timothy chapter 5 is actually talking about widows. And Paul is dealing there with widows who are needing to be taken care of by the congregation. And in 1 Timothy 5, if you'll begin there in verse 3, you'll see that Paul shows that there is a responsibility to take care of widows who are genuinely widows, who really are in need. Paul shows there that if there's a widow and they have children or grandchildren that can take care of the widow, that they're to do that it's the family's responsibility first to take care of one who is a widow. And he talks about the widow herself, what type of life that she should be living, and also what type of life she should have lived in the past. And those are the one that the church should feel an obligation to take care of. And so he gives a number of different qualifications of what should be true of the widow to be taken care of. But he goes down to verse 11, he talks about that they shouldn't be taken care of or supporting the younger widows. And he gives a reason why. Verse 11 says, "But refuse the younger widows, for when they have begun to grow wanton against Christ, they desire to marry, having condemnation because they have cast off their first faith. And besides, they learn to be idle, wandering about from house to house, and not only idle, but also gossips and busybodies, saying things which they ought not. Therefore I desire that the younger widows marry, bear children, manage the house, give no opportunity to the adversary to speak reproachfully. For some have already turned aside after Satan." Then he'll go back and talk about the responsibility of the family again to take care of those who are widows. But notice here Paul's saying there's some problems if you take on supporting a younger widow. That one thing, being a younger widow, that they could, again, maybe in their desire to marry, they could actually possibly, as Paul puts it, grow wanton against Christ. They desire to marry, and actually they end up leaving their first faith. And so he's warning against that being a possibility. But then the second thing, the part we're interested in, is that if you have a younger widow and she is being supported, well, he says in verse 13, they may learn to be idle. In other words, they're being supported by the church, and they have time on their hand. They're not working to trying to find some way of supporting themselves. They're not married and have the marriage responsibility to children, and so they have a lot of time on their hand. And what happens in their idleness is they get into trouble. They begin wandering about from house to house, and not only are they idle, but also they get involved in gossiping and being busybodies, and they end up saying things which they ought not to say. Now, first off, this tells us that being a busybody, being a gossip, are things that we shouldn't be, obviously. Paul is condemning that. This is something to avoid. We don't want them to be involved in that. And then also it teaches us that being idle is something that can be a contributor to being a gossip or busybody. Now that, I think, just makes sense, don't it? That when you think about someone with time on their hand, they're going to be more the type of person that are going to be tempted to start looking around at others and kind of snooping around in their business, and they're going to be more tempted to get involved in other people's cares. And they're going to be more tempted maybe to talk about other people because they have time on their hand. And that's what Paul's saying. These younger widows, he's saying it'd be better for them to marry. They're still young enough that they could marry again. They could have children. They could be managing the household, busy doing the type of work they should do, and they won't be tempted then to get involved in this type of behavior. So, that's some important lessons here for us, that one, we don't want to be busybodies, we don't want to be gossips, and we don't want to be idle. We don't want to be, having the type of life where we have so much time on our hands that we get tempted to do things that we ought not. And we've all heard the expression, idle hands is the devil's, I always mess my metaphors up. It's the devil's toolbox, I've heard some say. It's the devil's playground. The idea is that when you're not busy, the devil can take advantage of that, you see. And so we see here Paul showing that is true, that we need to avoid being idle, that it can lead one to being a gossip or busybody. And so he's given advice here that these young widows should go ahead and marry if possible. Now, another passage in the New Testament, we just back up a little bit, maybe a page or two, to 2 Thessalonians chapter 3, verses 11 through 12. 2 Thessalonians 3, verses 11 through 12 says, "For we hear that there are some who walk among you in a disorderly manner, not working at all, but are busybodies. Now those who are such we command and exhort through our Lord Jesus Christ, that they work in quietness and eat their own bread. But as for you, brethren, do not grow weary in doing good." Now, I've heard some in making comments or writing commentary on this, that it's possible that in Thessalonica, that because of the erroneous teaching that the Lord was going to come just at any time, that it was going to become very soon, that had caused some to believe that they should just stop working, that the Lord's going to come so soon, well, they just left their jobs and just wasn't worried about working and providing for themselves anymore. And that seems possible, don't it? If you're given, what Paul had talked about here in the 2 Thessalonians, that maybe some had taken that, that approach, that, hey, the Lord's coming, at any minute, so I don't need to be working, I'll just stop working. And Paul is showing here that because they were not working, that they were getting involved in things that they should. He says they're walking in a disorderly manner. They're not working at all. Instead, they're busybodies. And notice that Paul deals with this very seriously. He commands them that they exhort such through our Lord Jesus Christ, that they work in quietness and eat their own bread. And he tells the others for them to keep doing good. So Paul deals with this as a very serious matter. So again, just some lessons here from what Paul says. One, notice that being a busybody is connected with idleness. These folks were not working as they should, and in the idle time that they had, instead, they were busying themselves in other people's business. And Paul shows that they should, instead of doing that, they should be working in quietness. Notice in quietness, not, not gossiping or getting involved in other people's business, and eat their own bread. Don't be living off somebody else. Don't be going from house to house. Don't be a busybody. Instead, have a job here, work in quietness instead of doing that. And he encourages the Christians to keep doing the good that they were doing. So again, we see here, being a busybody is not what we're to do as Christians. If that's the case, as Paul exhorts here, we need to change that behavior and not do it. And then secondly, once again, we need to be careful about if we have too much time on our hands, it can be a temptation to get involved in being a busybody. And so we don't want to do that. Another passage here over in 1 Peter 4, verse 15 is just a real quick mention of being a busybody or meddler. Some translations may give it. 1 Peter 4 and 15, Paul says, "But let none of you suffer as a murderer, a thief, an evildoer, or as a busybody in other people's matters." Now this is an interesting verse, okay? Peter, of course, is telling Christians here that there's suffering that's ahead for you all. There's some fiery trials that's going to happen. You guys are going to be put to the test. You're going to be suffering. And he says, if you're suffering as a Christian, that's something you shouldn't be ashamed about. Nothing shameful at all in being, persecuted for being a Christian. But if you are being persecuted or you're suffering for, something else that you deserve to suffer, well, you should be ashamed of that. And it's in that vein that he writes this here. Verse 14, "If you're reproached for the name of Christ, blessed are you, for the Spirit of glory and of God rest upon you." Then in verse 15, then in contrast to that, he says, "But let none of you suffer as these things, a murderer, a thief, an evildoer, or as a busybody in other people's matters." Now, I honestly believe that oftentimes when we think about being a busybody, we probably put it in that category of not being such a serious offense, right? That, yeah, we shouldn't do that, but it's probably not a terrible thing if someone's doing that. But notice here that Peter says, you shouldn't suffer as a murderer, you shouldn't suffer as a thief, you shouldn't suffer as an evildoer, and you shouldn't suffer as a busybody. Now we'd say murder, that's pretty severe. A thief, yeah, that's a pretty bad person. An evildoer, yeah, that's a bad person. But Peter also says a busybody. He puts them in company with those others. That tells me that it is a serious matter. That now, obviously, there's differences in all of those sins. But Peter says all of these are things that if you're doing, he says, you're getting what you deserve if you suffer for these things. A murderer deserves to suffer. A thief deserves to suffer. An evildoer deserves to suffer. And a busybody deserves to suffer. He says, if you're suffering for those things, well, that's not something to be glad about. No, he says you're getting what you deserve. So that tells us, again, some things about being a busybody. That it is serious. That it is something that we don't want to have any part of. And if we are a busybody, then we deserve whatever suffering comes to us as a result of that. And so, we should take it serious. We should take being a busybody as a serious issue and one that we cannot be a part of as Christians. Well, I'd like to share just a few other verses kind of indirectly related to the matter of being a busybody. Turn with me back to Galatians chapter 6 for just a moment. And I like this passage because it both talks about how that we do need to be involved with other Christians to help one another, but it also teaches that we are to be responsible for ourselves as well. Galatians 6, verse 4 and 5, Paul there says, "But let each one examine his own works, and then he will have rejoicing in himself alone and not in another, for each one shall bear his own load." Now again, he had just said before that we are to consider if a brethren is overtaken in a trespass, we're to restore that one with a spirit of gentleness. There's a responsibility. You see a brother in sin, you're to help that person. You're to help restore that person. Verse 2, he tells us we are to bear one another's burdens. We're fulfilling the law of Christ when we bear one another's burdens. But then in verse 3 and following here, there's this warning about as we are involved with one another, there still is individual responsibility, and there is this idea of looking to yourself, not others. Verse 3, "If anyone thinks himself to be something when he is nothing, he deceives himself. But let each one examine his own work, and then he will have rejoicing in himself alone and not in another, for each one shall bear his own load. There is individual responsibility, and there's certainly to an extent that we are to be concerned with ourselves, and we're to look at ourselves, examine ourselves, and be concerned about our walk and how we behave ourselves as Christians. That is, we're not looking at other people and involving ourselves in them and neglecting our behavior. Rather, we first are look at ourselves and make sure that we're doing what we should. And in that vein, though, Paul is also saying, be careful that as you examine yourself, you don't get too high of opinion of yourself where you think, well, I've got it all together, and then look down on others. Again, that's an error that we could fall into. But we do need to take care of ourselves and then also look to help others out. But obviously the busybody is the one who is not looking at self, not concerned for self, rather has an opinion that he or she has it all together, and rather is interested in getting involved in everyone else's business, when really they need to look to themselves. And Paul's showing that's not the right balance here that we should have as Christians. Going over to Romans chapter 14, Paul there is talking about some matters that are really issues where they are matters of opinion, matters of application of Scripture that an individual must make, and showing you how that we need to be careful that in making certain applications to ourselves, we don't step over our bounds and start projecting or forcing our opinions on somebody else. Romans 14, first of all, notice at verse 3 and 4, he says, "Let not him who eats despise him who does not eat, and let not him who does not eat judge him who eats, for God has received him. Who are you to judge another servant? To his own master he stands or falls. Indeed, he will be made to stand, for God is able to make him stand." And skip down to verse 10 also. "But why do you judge your brother, or why do you show contempt for your brother? For we shall all stand before the judgment seat of Christ." Now, we've already seen in the passage in Galatians that we do have responsibility to a sinning brother. That, sometimes we have to restore a brother or sister who has sinned. That's responsibility. But here we're seeing that there are matters sometimes that individuals have to make decisions on. There are matters of applying the Scriptures that we make as an individual. And here specifically, Paul's talking about whether a person believes he can eat certain things, eat meats or not. Also, whether a person should observe a particular day or not. And he's showing here that when one person has decided that they should, another person has decided that they shouldn't, that these brethren in Christ shouldn't then turn around and attack the other brother in his decision and try to force their decision upon them. And he's saying that each of these who made these decisions, they are Christ's servant, and they stand before Christ, and they will be judged by Christ for the decisions that they have made. And so you don't have any business judging the other for the decision that they have made, is what he's teaching us there. So again, as you think about, a busybody is someone who will have that tendency to be, trying to direct others and tell others what to do. And there's some issues, even when it comes to applying the Scriptures, where we as individuals must make a decision, and that's something we're responsible as individuals. And as other Christians are not then to be judging us in that. And again, that's not to say that there are not times when we are to help a brother or sister, or we're to correct a brother or sister. We are. But when it comes to these matters of opinion here that we're talking about, that doesn't apply. We're not to meddle in others' business. I know you're familiar with Matthew 7, 1 through 5, where Jesus told us that we are not to judge. Matthew 7, verse 1 through 5, "Judge not that you be not judged. For with what judgment you judge, you will be judged, and with the measure you use, it will be measured back to you. And why do you look at the speck in your brother's eye, but do not consider the plank in your own eye? Or how can you say to your brother, let me remove the speck from your eye, and look, a plank is in your own eye? Hypocrite, first remove the plank from your own eye, and then you will see clearly to remove the speck from your brother's eye." What great wisdom here from our Lord. That before we go looking for the little fault in somebody else, we first look for that plank that's in our eye. And so often, we have faults ourselves. We need to take care of those before we go around looking to try to, find a fault in someone else. But the busybody is always looking for that speck in their brother's eye. always looking for the fault in others, always trying to get involved in other people's business when they themselves have some things they need to clean up. And Jesus saying, you need to clean up your own life first before you start thinking about how you can judge someone else. And then lastly, Matthew 12, verse 36. I trust again, it's familiar to you, but what a wonderful, wise thing that the Lord said. For by your words you will be justified, and by your words you will be condemned. We need to be so careful before we gossip, we spread rumors, or we go telling someone else what they need to be doing. We need to remember that our words will be judged. Our words will be that which will justify us or condemn us. So we need to be so careful about what we might be saying to others and what we might be saying about others. Again, we could certainly get ourselves in much trouble. There was an illustration one time that I heard that just really made the point to me about this business of, being nosy and getting into other people's business. It was someone who went to a chicken farm where they had, you've seen these, where there's just long buildings that are filled with chickens. And this person, the story goes, went in and there was a pile of chickens laying there dead. And he's like, well, what happened to these chickens? They catch some disease or something like that. And the chicken farmer said, no. He says, let me explain what happened. It's really quite interesting. He says, you'll have a chicken in here, and there'll be a little speck somewhere on its head or body. And another chicken will turn and look at that speck and go, what's that? Peck it. When he pecks that spot, well, guess what happened? He caused a little bloody spot on the chicken. Well, then another chicken looks and says, what's that? And they peck that bloody spot. And then pretty soon another chicken pecks it, and another chicken pecks it, and another chicken pecks it, until they literally kill that chicken. They will peck it to death. And I know I'm telling the look on Deborah's face, it's really gross. I know, I'm sorry. but evidently it's true that chickens will peck a chicken to death like that. But you think about the application to us as humans, we can be like that, can't we? That we can start looking at someone else and we see some little thing that we think is not what we think it should be, and we start pecking at them, and pecking at them, and pecking at them, and then pretty soon everybody else is, because we told everybody else about it, and we can literally peck somebody to death over something that shouldn't be an issue at all. And to me, that just is such a great illustration of avoiding being a busybody, avoiding being the person who gossips or spreads rumors or is causing contention among folks. And we as Christians especially should not engage in that type of behavior. So more than just something that can be, again, type of behavior that is something we dislike, we do need to realize that actually the scriptures do speak on this, and that we're not to be busybodies or gossips. And if we are, we're not pleasing to the Lord. And that's something that we need to make changes in our lives and cut that behavior out. And do our best, rather, to live in love and harmony with others, especially with our brothers and sisters in Christ. The lesson is yours this morning, and if you're here and you're not a Christian, would like to obey the gospel, certainly we would love to assist you in doing that. You just come forward this morning and let us know of your desire to become a Christian, and we will help you with that. If you're here this morning and as a Christian there is things wrong in your life, certainly you need to make those things right with the Lord. If that involves maybe letting the congregation know of what's going on or asking for prayers, then again, we're here this morning gathered together. It would be a great time to let us know of that, and we would be glad to do that. But if you are subject to invitation, why don't you come as we all stand together and sing at this time.